we see now that Putin actually spent days to respond. He did not declare a state of war. He did not declare martial law. He did not dignify the Ukrainian regular military units operating in Ukraine as legitimate military combatants under the norms and law of military undertakings. That tells us that Putin continues to subordinate what should be a militarily sound objective and undertaking to his larger political concerns. He remains very scared of his own people. He remains concerned about asking the Russians to sacrifice through mass mobilization of the country.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the incursion into the Kursk region. And I'm delighted to be joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. George is the head of their Russia team and a regular guest here on Frontline. George, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, James. Good to see you again.
I mean, where to start really with the events of the past week or so. What is your reading of the situation now? We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. What is your reading on the progress Ukraine has made?
Sure thing. So it's really fascinating, firstly, to look at this campaign and look at how it's disrupted the general tempo of operations across the entire theater. Before we get into the specifics of this operation, I think it's important to highlight that over the better part of the last year, the Russians have maintained the initiative across the entirety of the theater. That is, they were able to control when to attack, where to attack, the intensity of those attacks, and so on and so forth. And essentially, how to serve up a series of dilemmas to the Ukrainian command to how to respond. Now, the Russians no longer have the initiative across the whole theater. The Ukrainians have contested the initiative in the north, and now it's the Ukrainians who are, in fact, imposing some dilemmas on how to respond to this crisis in Moscow. In terms of the campaign that we see unfolding right now, we initially thought it was a raid on the first day. That's how it was reported. It was unclear. And we've also had a lot of patterns of Ukrainians conducting cross-border raids. But after the first 24 hours, it became very clear that given the size and scale and the type of equipment, the type of activity we're seeing, this is definitely not a raid. It's a campaign. It's an operational level undertaking. And what we see so far is the Ukrainians, at least as of yesterday, they've by our assessment, we confirm from open sources, so it's not to say that it's completely comprehensive. The Ukrainians have been able to bring their forward line of own troops to intersect with at least 41 different Russian settlements within Kursk Oblast. They've managed to expand their forward line of own troops so that it encompasses roughly 840 square kilometers of territory that we can assess from open sources. The Ukrainians yesterday claimed that they managed to get about 1,000 square kilometers. I'm not going to deny that. I'm just saying from what we can observe from our open sources, we can get to 840, which is pretty close. And what's really more interesting than I think what the Ukrainians are doing is what the Russians are and are not doing and the effectiveness of their response.
Yeah, so what have you made of the Russian response? I mean, clearly they were caught out by this, and given the size of the border between Russia and Ukraine, it was always going to be hard for them to respond immediately. But were you surprised that Ukraine have been able to make so much progress within just a week?
I was surprised that the Ukrainians conducted the campaign. I mean, that's another thing I'll praise the Ukrainian forces for. They managed to achieve not only tactical surprise, but operational level surprise. And the Russians were absolutely not prepared for this operation. I'm not surprised that the Ukrainians managed to project as deep and as far as they did, because the Ukrainians brought a decent amount of combat power, elements of several brigades, to this very weak part of the Russian line, arguably the weakest part of the Russian line. And it's undermanned, it's underdefended. And when just because there's some trenches there from the Surovikin line and there's some field fortifications, when they're not manned properly, they don't actually provide a rigid defense. And so to see the Ukrainians sort of blitz past that within a matter of hours is not surprising at all. What I was surprised about was the Russian response. I think it's very, very telling that now that we have, American, German, and French combat vehicles rolling around in Russia proper, the first time there's been, foreign military equipment operating on Russian soil since the Second World War, it's quite telling that Vladimir Putin took several days to actually put forward his response. I mean, there was essentially no response for the first 3 days. It was only on Saturday that the Russian government declared that they are conducting a counter-terrorist operation. Not that they're going to declare war, very notably not that, Putin very much could have used this opportunity to say, this is the NATO-backed, Ukrainian proxy war to destroy and dismantle Russia. They're finally at it. We have these foreign vehicles rolling around in Russia. He did not do that. He could have called for mobilization. Putin, in fact, did the opposite thing. He said the volunteer response that we've had to respond to this is wonderful, which is a way for him to signal to his population that he's not going to declare another round of mobilization. And, even if they weren't to declare war, there's other things that the Russians could have done that would, I think, be more effective than declaring a counter-terrorist operation. They could have declared martial law as well, which would have allowed the Russians to have a better, I think, response, commandeer equipment, set up emergency responses, and so on and so forth. But in doing this counter-terrorist operation, they've subordinated the entire counter-operation not to the military, but to the internal police, to the Russian FSB, the Federal Security Service, which is very interesting because the Russian response, the actual units on the ground and the men with guns that are responding, they're coming from a mishmash of different organizations that come from different chains of command. And it seems like the command and control for how they're going to integrate all these different disparate forces, it's very much unclear. I mean, we have the Russian National Guard, which is subordinate to the Russian presidential administration. We have the Russian FSB Border Guard Service. We have Interior Ministry troops. We have conscripts. We have irregular forces, and we have the bulk of the combat power seems to be coming from the regular Russian military. But it's not going to be a Russian military general who's going to command this. It's going to be either the head of the FSB, Bortnikov, or from reports that we collected yesterday, it's possible that this could be being overseen by a Kremlin official named Alexander Dumin. So we'll see, to what extent the Kremlin will be able to effectively manage a joint headquarters for all these different guys coming together, many of which, I would add, mission and mandate does not include conducting combined arms major military operations.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because we've spoken for months now on Frontline about the quality or lack of quality of troops that Russia is using on the front line in Ukraine. As you say, a lot of conscripts, a lot of migrants, poorly trained. And you can get away with that, I suppose, if you're just feeding them into the meat grinder, as it were, on the front line on the offense. But if you're defending, you need better troops, surely.
Yes and no. 2 points. So firstly, and this is a technical point, the Russians actually are on the precipice, I think, of a political crisis, potential political crisis with the conscripts. So by Russian law, it's not lawful for conscripts to serve in expeditionary military operations. And for the large part, the Kremlin has not deployed conscripts to Ukraine. Conscripts are, of course, those young men that have compulsory military service. They get their notice, they do their year service. And there was a big scandal in Russia in early 2022 after Putin said he would not send conscripts to Ukraine. It turned out that conscripts had indeed been sent to Ukraine in small numbers. Some were killed and captured. And then Putin met with the mothers and did a whole bunch of damage control, and then made a very deliberate and conscientious effort to ensure that conscripts don't go to Ukraine. For the most part, and there's been a couple small exceptions here and there, but for the most part, those conscripts have been kept in Russia. Now, when the Ukrainians then charge into Russia and they manage to breach, with their reconnaissance elements, 20, 25 kilometers deep into Russia very quickly, they ran up against the conscripts, Serbian conscript units, and also against conscripts in the Russian FSB Border Guard Service. And the Ukrainians consequently killed and captured those conscripts. Conscript deaths and casualties are very politically sensitive in the Russian Federation. If you look at the late Soviet period, the Concerted Mothers organizations that organized protests and rallies and different civil society or organization movements against, the Soviet powers, the Soviet authorities' use of conscripts in Afghanistan. And then even in the early, in the 90s with the Chechen wars as well, I mean, those deaths were very, very politically unpalatable for the Russian population, and it caused a lot of problems to the Kremlin. So depending on the use of the conscripts now in operations, not in Ukraine, but in Russia, that's actually very politically sensitive for the Kremlin. So that's the first point, and it's interesting, something to look forward to in the future. The second point, do you need better forces for offense or defense? I think you actually need better forces for offense, to be honest, because fundamentally, general rough rule of thumb, when conducting offensive operations, you need to have 3-to-1 attacker to defender ratio advantage. So it's in many regards, it's easier to do defense. And of course, when you're doing defense, you do have home turf advantage. You're fighting to defend your homeland. You have shorter interior lines. It's easier to have logistic support. So it's a lot harder. It's much easier to do defense. It's a lot harder to do offense, generally, ceteris paribus. So, this is a kind of operation that the Russians should be able to do better. And I'd note that, the Russians have by choice not defended their border regions with Ukraine. If you were to look up the length of the international border between in northern Ukraine, that's not the front line, there's about a good roughly 1,000 kilometers of border. It's about 1,200 kilometers of border if you include the border with Belarus, which is basically the Russians have it as a forward operating base. And the Russians, for the last 2 years, have conscientiously decided to not defend that. It is not manned properly. And the Ukrainians have now exploited that because the Russians have simply been marshaling all of their forces into Ukraine to fight in the active areas. And this recent Kursk campaign really shows the extent to which the Russians have availed themselves to their planning assumption that they have sanctuary, that Western powers will not allow Ukraine to strike Russian territory or use Western resources to wage operations in Russia or strike Russian military targets. And one of the positive effects of this campaign can be, in my judgment, is forcing a decision point on the Kremlin. Will the Kremlin now actually reevaluate its critical planning assumptions about this war and properly defend the border regions? And if the Russians do indeed, and I hope they do, substantially divert a bunch of resources to now cover that 1,000 kilometers of international border, lest the Ukrainians exploit it as they have, then that is, that's not a trivial amount of resources, and that will substantially increase the cost for what the Russians can bring to bear within the active parts of the fighting within Ukraine.
And that's a key point. Is there any evidence so far, George, of troops being diverted from the front line in eastern Ukraine?
There is evidence. I'd note that it's very interesting to see where the Russians are and are not pulling and redeploying their forces from. So let's just sort of work clockwise around the theater in Ukraine, starting at like the 12 o'clock position. Back in May, the Russians began their cross-border renewed offensive in Kharkiv with a large formation of forces, an operationally significant group called the Northern Grouping of Forces. That Northern Grouping of Forces has, the Russian reports suggest that they've redeployed some elements of the First Guards Tank Army slightly to the west to then send those away from sort of the Belgorod, Kharkiv area to go towards Kursk to be part of the response force. We've seen some reports of also Chechen forces that were previously operating in Luhansk redeploying towards the Kursk direction. Moving to Donetsk, there's been a medley of small irregular forces and perhaps one naval infantry brigade, elements of one naval infantry brigade, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, that was previously operating in Donetsk Oblast that redeployed. I'd note, though, that the Russian main priority sector for offensive operations this year is in Donetsk Oblast. We've talked many times, I think, about Pokrovsk, Avdiivka, Chasiv Yar, and Toretsk. The Russians are not conducting large-scale redeployments or very many redeployments, for that matter, from these large priority areas. So it seems that the Russian command is making the conscious decision to maintain as much combat power it can for these offensive drives. Continuing around the rest of the theater, in the south, in Zaporizhia, we've seen reports of elements of some brigades that were previously operating there from the Eastern Military District also redeploying to Kursk. And then finally in Kherson, sort of the southwesternmost corner, we got some reports of elements of some battalions of likely the Russian 104th Airborne Division redeploying as well. So that is to say, yes, there are reports of some Russian forces redeploying. Notably, the trend shows that the Russians are taking the units from the places that have been largely dormant sectors of the theater. The place where the Russians are leaning in with their offensive operations, they are notably not redeploying those forces yet. And in terms of prospectus, I think it's too clear. It's too early to tell to what extent this is going to affect the tempo of operations. That very much remains an open question. and we'll see over the coming weeks.
I suppose one of the biggest questions at the moment, George, is for how long can Ukraine hold the territory it's captured in Russia? What is your sense on that?
I think it fully depends on the Russian response. So if the Russians send only, conscript units, FSB border guards, Russian National Guard units, and other various cobbled together cats and dogs under a dubious joint command in an ineffective way, I think the Ukrainians have a decent chance of being able to dig in and stay in. I'd also note that there was a HIMARS strike, long-range rocket artillery strike, that struck a Russian convoy that was moving in the direction of Kursk back on August 9th. So it seems that the Ukrainians are able to use some long-range fires to support their forces as well, which is good for their ability to defend what they have. I don't think the Ukrainian objective is to hold a whole lot of territory, but fundamentally, unless the Russians really do redeploy a large amount of combat power, like frontline units, to push them out, then I think the Ukrainians can find a situation where it's not going to be terribly costly to hold their positions. And I'd add that, like I said, even if the Ukrainians are forced to pull out a little bit and they lose a lot of what we currently see on the map, that's not a bad thing. If it comes at the trade-off of now the Russians actually have to divert a substantial amount of their combat power and forces to now defend an extra 1,000 kilometers worth of border that they essentially get for free now, that would be a preferable trade, in fact.
Are you clear what the primary objective of this incursion is? I mean, is it to divert troops and to make Russia position troops along the border and away from the front line? Or is it just to regain the initiative and boost Ukrainian morale? Is it to send a political message to Putin? Is it a mixture of all three?
Yeah, candidly, I'm not going to speculate on what the Ukrainian objective might be here. The Ukrainians have achieved operational and tactical surprise. Nobody, unless they have access to the Ukrainian command, actually knows what their objectives are. I'm not going to pretend to know them. There's a lot of positive things and a lot of dilemmas that the Ukrainians are imposing on the Russians with this campaign, many of which I'm confident are not the main objective. So you can advance multiple lines of effort through one offensive operation. There's a lot of good things, but I'm not sure which is the main. And even if I did, I wouldn't want to share it because I'd like to think that the Kremlin would continue to put forward ineffective responses as opposed to getting sure on really effective responses.
Some people have suggested that Ukraine may be trying to take the nuclear power station in Kursk. Is that realistic?
I'm not sure on what basis that's being argued, to be honest. If the Ukrainians continue advancing, and by the way, the rate of Ukrainian advance has slowed down over the last 72 hours, so ceteris paribus, I'm skeptical of the Ukrainians to be able to seize that, but who knows? Maybe they will. I don't think that would be an intrinsic objective, because I'm not exactly sure what that gets the Ukrainians. I think in terms of the kinds of operational effects you would seek to achieve, it's more important to do some of the things we talked about, increasing the cost for the Russians, demonstrating to Western powers that you can indeed conduct operations against on Russian soil against the Russians. It does not result with massive Russian retaliation, and hopefully changing the Kremlin's, invalidating the Kremlin's planning assumptions about what it does and doesn't need to prosecute this war. But we'll see.
And just to inject a note of caution on the Ukrainian side of things, it was interesting you mentioned earlier, George, that you need, broadly speaking, 3 times as many troops when you're on the offense compared to when you're defending. And we've spoken about the issues with manpower that Ukraine has had anyway. If it sustained significant casualties with this incursion, what could the long-term consequences of that be for Kyiv?
Yeah, that's the big risk, right? Like as we speak, as the Ukrainians make gains in the north near Kursk, the Russians continue to make gains in the southeast near Avdiivka and in the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russian main effort for this year. It is to be determined, right? If I think historians and analysts are going to debate for the rest of this year, and I think probably for decades in the military analysis community, was it the right decision in late 2024 to conduct a major operation in Kursk and send those forces there, as opposed to sending them to the east to reinforce. I don't think it's not clear right now that there's a correct right or wrong answer, and there may not be. I mean, historians make similar debates about all kinds of decisions that military commanders have made over the course of history. Like a famous example, and since we're on the theme of Russia, I'll go back to the Napoleonic Wars, like with the Battle of Borodino, which was essentially a settlement just before the French imperial forces managed to get to Moscow. And their General Kutuzov put up a decisive defense. And at the end of the day, after a very bloody battle, it was a tactical French victory. They managed to get the Russians out of there, and the Russians retreated. But the Russians had an operational objective, had an operational victory, in that they defeated the critical mass of Napoleon's combat power, and Napoleon did not have enough combat power to finish the campaign. The Russians burned Moscow, and they fell back further, and then the winter finished the job. Historians to this day debate about a critical decision that Napoleon made during the Battle of Borodino, which was, should have Napoleon essentially sent his Praetorian Guard, basically the reserve regiment that was attached with the group that's designed to protect Napoleon, into combat, and had he deployed it decisively, could he have had a better chance of a better odds of not losing as many of his main force in the battle? Of course, if he was successful, then perhaps Napoleon might have had enough combat power to finish the war on French terms. If not, then not only would have he had a tactical defeat or an operational defeat at Borodino, but he wouldn't have his Imperial Guard to protect him personally and ensure that he'd be able to have personal security. So that is all to say, we shall see.
I wanted to ask you about the international response, because this is really interesting. President Biden has said he's been in contact with Kyiv constantly over the last 7 days, although the White House has stressed it's not been engaged in any aspect of the planning or preparation. Obviously, there is speculation as to the risk of escalation here if it's seen to be a Western-endorsed incursion. What do you read into the response from Ukraine's Western allies so far?
I don't know anything concretely, but my sense is that the White House was caught by surprise by this campaign. Because I recall it was either a White House or a Department of Defense spokesperson in the first day or two of the operation, essentially stating that they reached out to Kyiv for clarification for what's going on, which indicated to me that I think they were not expecting this campaign. And that is very interesting. And all the reports that we've seen surface since then suggest that, the Ukrainians held very close to their chest their plans for this campaign, this operation, which, honestly, good for them. Good for them. We know that there's been a propensity for, elements of the U.S. government to, out of risk of, escalation with Russia, to share details with the Russians. And we also know, of course, the United States government, we have our own leaks. Like, our officials talk to media. Our National Guardsmen leak classified information, right? I mean, that was a big scandal last year ahead of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive. And it's these sort of, loose lips that sink ships and that remove the ability for Ukraine to achieve, even on a near transparent battlefield due to, all the drones and fabulous intelligence that exists out there, operational surprise. So, it's very interesting to see that basically after the Ukrainians conducted the operation, they got a ex post facto endorsement and support. We have subsequently seen, HIMARS strikes, at least what seems to be a probable HIMARS strike within Russia. And the European states, Washington aside, the European states seem to be leaning into this as well. So I would be absolutely surprised if you told me, 6 months ago that Berlin would be comfortable with having there be German vehicles rolling around in Russia, right? Like that seemed something that's like utterly impossible, but here we are now. So I do hope we continue leaning into this, because if the alliance supporting Ukraine leans into actually taking the fight to Russia, and getting decisive about removing all the safety nets, removing all the luxuries that we have provided the Russians so far in this war, then the Russians, I think, will not win.
I mean, on the topic of what Berlin is comfortable with, it's interesting the German prosecutors investigating the Nord Stream gas pipeline bombings have now obtained an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian citizen. I mean, I suppose, there are strong arguments you could make if you were speaking from a Ukrainian point of view as to why that needed to happen. But I suppose it's that old adage, and it's comparable to the current situation, better to seek forgiveness than ask permission.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not familiar with the Nord Stream report, that's actually the first time I heard about it. But I don't find it particularly surprising. And yeah, and look, uh, the Russians constitute a clear and present threat to the NATO alliance. They're increasing their sabotage activities within Eastern Europe and within the alliance. And look, we finally now, well, really starting 2.5 years ago with the biggest full scale invasion, like the scales fell from the eyes, and all of the Europeans, many of the Europeans, I won't say all, many of the Europeans finally realized the extent to which Russia is not just sort of a different type of state on the European periphery. It is a fundamentally is an existential threat to the European way of life. And so, and you, Russia's leverage of gas, its weaponization of gas and energy towards Europe is one of its key columns, pillars of power that it actually uses to try to defeat NATO and defeat the Europeans. So I don't think we're in a place now where the Europeans understand that the Russians were never going to be regular trade partners. They were never going to be regular allies. That they've always sort of wanted to undermine our way of life, so to speak. And it's unfortunate things happened the way they did, but Russia was fundamentally predatory and better late than ever.
And just finally, George, as we go into the coming week or so, what are the key things you will be monitoring to gauge the progress of this Ukrainian incursion?
Yeah, we'll be continuing to, of course, track what we can confirm are the Ukrainian advances further into Kursk Oblast. A couple questions that we have remaining are: will the Ukrainians open up supporting axes of advance elsewhere? There's been other raids that the Ukrainians have reportedly conducted in the same time span near Belgorod, other locations in Kursk. It'll be interesting to see if those actually develop or materialize further. Other key questions, and this is really the most important thing: how effective is the Russian response going to be? This joint FSB-led headquarters, how exactly are they going to take in the Russian National Guard, the Ministry of Defense forces, and the Ministry of Interior forces, and the FSB border guards, and work out something that actually has a semblance of a competent command and control structure? We've been talking for a long time, for months now, about how the regular Russian military, even in and of itself, has difficulties doing command and control. And that's just with all their own guys that in principle they should be able to manage. Add in a whole bunch of other domestic police and security forces that come from different chains of command. I remain very skeptical about the effectiveness of the chosen response. The other thing I think will be interesting to look into is Putin's behavior and the assumptions that are thinking, challenging sort of our myths about Putin's behavior. I think if you had told someone that we would have American and German and French combat vehicles rolling around in Russia, told that to someone 6 months ago, they would be incredulous and they would say something like, "Oh, are you looking to get nuked by Russia or something?" But we see now that Putin actually spent days to respond. He did not declare a state of war. He did not declare martial law. He did not dignify the Ukrainian regular military units operating in Ukraine as legitimate military combatants under the norms and law of military undertakings. He called them terrorists, and then essentially set up a weird, unorthodox headquarters for the domestic police to respond. That tells us that Putin continues to subordinate what should be a militarily sound objective and undertaking to his larger political concerns. He remains very scared of his own people. He remains concerned about asking the Russians to sacrifice through mass mobilization of the country. I think this should have been sort of the no-brainer case for Putin to be able to call on the Russian country to defend the Russian motherland, but he is not willing to do that.
George, always fascinating to get your insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you so much for having me, James. Always a pleasure.